than when the coalition came to power back in 2010. 260,000 more people came to this country than left it. Now, that's well above the government's target. The Conservatives said at the last election that they wanted to reduce net migration, quote, to tens of thousands by May 2015. But even before the recent figures came out this week, the Home Secretary, Theresa May, downgraded the Prime Minister's pledge from a promise to a comment.
When we made that comment, when we said our aim was that what we
didn't
wanted
want to use
to
the
do,
word promise there. Wasn't it a promise?
We said we would be aiming to bring the net migration down to the tens of thousands, and we wanted to do that within this Parliament.
Well, on Friday, the Prime Minister gave his view on the rising figures.
Immigration benefits Britain, but it needs to be controlled, it needs to be fair, and it needs to be centred around our national interest. That is what I want.
And he set out plans for curbing welfare benefits for migrants.
EU migrants should have a job offer before they come here. UK taxpayers will not support them if they don't. And once they're in work, they won't get benefits or social housing from Britain unless they've been here for at least 4 years. Yes, these are radical reforms, but they are also reasonable and fair.
Well, of course, immigration is very high up on the political agenda. So today we're going to discuss these figures, what they mean, and the reaction here in the UK. Well, joining me is David Coleman, who's a professor of demographics at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at Oxford University. And Simon Woolley is the director of Operation Black Vote. And Alp Mehmet is the vice chairman of a pressure group called Migration Watch. Well, first of all, David Coleman, over to you. What's your reaction to the figures?
Well, I was disappointed because I feel that the aim of restricting migration and moderating the flow is a good one. It's obviously been a huge blow to the Prime Minister and very embarrassing to the government, as the stumbling response of Mrs. Theresa May made very evident in your earlier clip.
Well, all right. Where do we go from here? What's to be done?
Well, what's to be done is partly what the Prime Minister has set out in his speech, which is a series of fairly moderate proposals in terms of the scale of the problem, which would clearly have been cleared in advance with his EU colleagues, and which rather startlingly endorse the principle of free movement of labour, and in that respect, of course, sell the past from the point of view of a really serious control over migration from the EU, which at the moment is the main focus of interest. The government has, of course, reduced migration from outside the EU by about a quarter, which is something, but there's a lot more to go. The measures in the speech are, from the point of view of moderating migration, I think sensible and worthy, but they're certainly not going to have a major effect in any reasonable span of time on flows of migrants into the country.
So is it the fact that we're part of the EU at the heart of the matter?
In my view, yes. And this issue will run and run for as long as the Prime Minister feels obliged to endorse the principle of free movement of labour, however much it may be tweaked from the point of view of welfare benefits and so on. This of course is because he wants to avoid a head-on confrontation with his EU colleagues. Because if he insists on seriously moderating the principle of free movement of labour, then he's almost guaranteeing, I think, that they would not agree to his proposals, and that means he'd have to go into the referendum almost promising to not support continued membership of the EU if his recent pronouncements can be interpreted. And that's the last thing he wants to do.
Well, Simon Woolley is the director of Operation Black Vote. Simon, what's your reaction to the figures?
Well, I'm disappointed in the debate, actually, in the framing of the debate, because a lot of people say that we rarely talk about immigration, and it seems to me for the last 5 or 10 years we've done nothing but talk about immigration, but sadly from a deeply, deeply negative view. In sharp contrast, other countries are looking at immigration as a plus, as a positive, as a way of rejuvenating stagnation in the economy, ideas, energy, and a truer story, Bill, that I'd like to be looking at is the reason why England and the UK has been doing well, and I would argue it's because we have such diversity, energy, hundreds of thousands of migrant workers living in buy-to-let properties, which has helped the housing boom, particularly in England, and stop demonising, because of course we don't only demonise hard-working people, but we also very quickly demonise those communities that have been here for many, many years, such as African, Caribbean and Asian communities, because once you start demonising migrants, that thread of racism towards all people that look different takes root into our nation, Bill, and actually poisons the nation's soul. That's very worrying.
Well, stay with us. Alp Mehmet is the vice chairman of Migration Watch. He's also a former immigration officer, former ambassador to Iceland, and a first-generation immigrant. He came over in the 1950s to this country. Your reaction to the figures?
Well, first of all, guilty to all those as charged. Simon is a great man. I know lots about him. He doesn't know me, but I know of him, and he's done a fantastic job in involving people in the political process, and I'm thoroughly with that. But what we're talking about here is scale. We're talking about the rate at which our population is increasing at the moment. Going at this rate of 200, it doesn't even have to be 260,000 net a year. Somewhat lower than that, we're still adding 10 million people to our population over the next 20 years. 80% of that 10 million will be largely the result of direct or indirect migration. We cannot do that. Of course, we can say fewer than 570,000 people or thereabouts who are coming in at the moment can come in, and at the same time we can have all the engineers, all the doctors that we need. It's not wrong to say that if you are coming here, saying you're coming here to do one thing but intend something else, that you should be kept out. It's not wrong that we should remove those who haven't got permission here. I mean, all these things can happen and bring numbers down without having any impact at all on the sort of immigration that has done huge good for this country.
Well, yeah, let's make a little bit of balance here in the discussion about all the good that the immigrants have done for this country. How would you argue that case? What is the good that they bring?
You know, any modern, dynamic country, a dynamic economy, of course, is going to have immigration coming in, people coming in, adding, contributing their skills, but also becoming a part of our society. And what concerns me most is that on this sort of scale, it becomes so much more difficult to do the sort of things that Simon wants to do, to involve people in our society, make them a part of our society, rather than becoming isolated communities from different parts of the world. That's what worries me, and that's why it's imperative to bring numbers down.
Well, Simon Woolley, Director of Operation Black Vote, is that the England and UK you see, isolated communities from around the world?
No, I don't. I say I'm here in London, and it's a teeming metropolis. Everybody wants to come here because of its dynamism, its energy, and actually, it bucks the trend on so many levels. Financially, on an educational basis, London outperforms the rest of the country, and one of the factors of London having a good education results has been diversity. I mean, we're not even beginning to talk about that. We're not talking about whoever talks about the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are here, and they're renting buy-to-let properties for lots of middle-class men and women who are wanting to better their lives. There's a good news story to be told. What's interesting is that, in contrast to the UK, the Germans are saying, look, we have an Asian population. We need to have a kind of a rejuvenation that they had after the Second World War, when they invited Turkish workers to to rebuild Germany and those from Eastern Europe, and it was a result for German success. Now they're rethinking that project and saying we need to do that again. Here in the UK, we're saying everything bad is foreign. The result, it's a number of things are happening, Bill. One, you get a self-fulfilling prophecy. You get ordinary people who ordinarily would embrace diversity, beginning to hate their neighbours. So we're doing nothing for the economy, and yet the society's soul is being so poisoned that you can go to places around the UK, ask people in the pubs, and the only talk is their hatred of people who don't look like them.
Well, earlier this week I spoke to Dr. Carlos Vargas Silva. He's from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford, and he helped explain the figures.
Essentially, the number is for net migration is 260,000, 260. This is the number that the government promised they were going to take down to 100,000. So essentially, they're above the number that they promised, and they're not going to be able to deliver that promise for the end of this parliament. There are two reasons for that. The main one is that the policies that they established in 2011 didn't decrease non-EU net migration enough in order for them to hit the target. So they cut some students, they cut some family members, family migration, they cut some workers, but the costs were not big enough in order to deliver that decrease. In order to make things a bit more complicated for the government, now non-EU EU net migration, so migration from within the European Union, has increased. And most of this is due to migration from the old EU countries. Those are the countries that were members of the EU before 2004, so countries like Spain that have high unemployment rates right now, and the workers, nationals of those countries are looking for work options in the UK.
So it's economic migration.
It is largely economic migration, particularly from the EU. The large majority come for work reasons, and what is more, they're finding employment in the country.
How do you know that?
We know from the statistics, so we know that their employment rates, that is the share of the working age population that is working, is over 80%. So it's quite high. Most of those who come from those countries and out of working age population are currently employed.
A lot of people might think that there is such a thing as health migration or tourism, and people living on benefits, coming here to live on benefits. Do you have any evidence if that is actually the case or not?
Well, we know the number of EU nationals who claim benefits, any type of benefits in the UK. That number is 131,000, so 131. If you compare that to the population, which is about 2.8 million, it means that only a small fraction of those who come from EU countries, nationals of EU countries, are claiming benefits. And even among those 131,000, it may be the case that many of them just came here for legitimate reasons and lost their jobs, so they're here and they're claiming some kind of benefit. So it means that the number is quite small. While it may be the case that there are a few people that have actually done that, come to the UK for the purpose of claiming benefits, given the total number that are claiming benefits, one can say that at least it's not a very common thing.
What can the government do to get the immigration figures down?
In the case, you can split it between the part that they can control and the part that they cannot control. The part that they can control, which is non-EU net migration, what they have done is that they have cut bogus students, but in order to reduce migration more, you have to cut legitimate students. They have cut some workers. They have put a cap on number of workers and increase the requirement for workers, but in order to increase it more, you will have to cut highly skilled workers, and that's something that people don't want to do. And they have cut migration from family members, so if you're of British national and you want to marry someone from outside the EU, they have put a restriction on that of 18,600 as your income, so you need an income higher than that. But in order to reduce migration more in that regard, they will have to restrict migration from family members of people that can actually support them. So there are not that many options for the government to cut non-EU net migration. In the case of EU migration, most of the things that they can do is to delay access to welfare benefits for a certain period. But as we discussed, most of this migration is for work reasons, and they are working in the country. So delaying the access to benefits is unlikely to have a big impact on this flow.
Why do you think that immigration, particularly now, is so high up on the political agenda?
Well, that is an interesting thing. I mean, immigration has always been high up on the political agenda. It was an important topic for the 2010 election. It is an important topic for this election, and I'm willing to bet that it's going to be a very important topic for the next election. So immigration has always been one of the main topics for the elections. If we look at surveys of public opinion in this country, a majority of people have opposed more migration for decades. So it is an important topic for elections, not only in this one, but across the recent decades.
You're an immigrant, aren't you?
I am an immigrant.
You came from where?
I am a bit complicated. I come from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, which is a U.S. territory, so I have a U.S. passport.
Did you have any trouble getting in?
Into this country, no. I mean, this country, if you are a qualified person, so you have education and you have money in the bank and you have the resources, it's relatively easy to get a visa to come to this country. You also need a job offer. So you need a job, you need education, and you need some reserve money in the bank. If you have all those three things, it is not extremely complicated to get a visa to this country.
And that's the view of Dr. Carlos Vargas Silva from the Migration Observatory at the University of Oxford. Tony from Kidlington got through to the program. He says, when I go abroad, I have to get travel insurance to pay for any health expenditure while I'm abroad. Well, shouldn't people who come here to the UK have to have some kind of insurance policy so they aren't taking advantage of the NHS? Simon Woolley from Operation Black Vote, what's your take on that?
Well, often when we go abroad, we have insurance, but sometimes we don't. And yet if we went to a hospital in Spain, we wouldn't be turned away. And I would hope likewise here. Look, yes, we've got to stop people abusing the system. But as your last speaker stated, they're in the tiny minority. There are many, many more benefits than there are negatives. So I would argue that the discussion is broadly political. And in this political discussion, that politicians seek votes by sowing fear. Yes, the speaker said you can, and one of the big numbers for migration are international students. There are many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of international students that seek to come to the UK because of its prestige at universities. You could cut that number by half, but our universities would probably close. And so there's a cost benefit for people wanting to come in. Like Garcia said, they're skilled, they're energetic, they work hard. Bill, why don't we talk about that?
Well, a final word to David Coleman, Emeritus Professor of Demographics at the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. David, yes, why don't we talk about the good aspects of immigration? Why don't we focus on some of the things that Simon has been bringing up? Because, after all, his main argument is that the way the discussion is framed so far is poisoning the soul of the country.
I don't think it is poisoning the soul of the country. What was poisoning the soul of the country was the suppression which discussion of immigration had to endure during the earlier years of the previous government, and indeed during some periods of the previous Tory government. And now it's out in the open. It's very much more healthy. I liked many of Simon Woolley's comments, which were warm and genial, but I do think they're far too rose-tinted, especially the curious idea that a major benefit is to do with taking up housing on buy to rent. The problem is that immigration is a very varied matter. There are very different sorts of people coming for different sorts of purposes, with different sorts of effects. We have heard, after all, on this program, very little apart from the benefits of migration. Mr. Cameron's speech listed lots of benefits of migration, many of which I'm afraid were overblown, and some of them were seriously misleading. They were rather like the comments which we got from Labour spokesmen in the year 2000, extolling the merits of immigration in a rather exaggerated fashion before they opened the doors to very large numbers of people. If one can introduce one figure, a recent widely quoted study from University College London from Professor Dustman, widely understood in the press to emphasize the advantage of migration, in fact came to the conclusion, despite its orientation towards benefit, that there was a net cost of between 115 and 160 billion pounds arising over the last 10 years from immigration all told, and the benefits from Eastern European EU migration, which ended in 2008, the benefits, I mean, were a mere 5 billion. So that puts some sort of perspective on the fiscal aspect of things.
We'll have to leave it there, David. I'm sorry about that, but thank you very much. That's David Coleman, Emeritus Professor at Oxford University. Simon Woolley